And just to introduce for people who have no idea, you do have a sort of a date range, not a hard date, but you say that there will be no human by 2026.
Yeah, and of course, the habitat for humans will be lost before then at the global level. That's a process that's already underway. You know, at the southern border of the United States, we're seeing some serious indications of loss of habitat regionally. So people from Central America are not leaving Central America to go on vacation. They're not headed for Yosemite or Yellowstone. They're not headed to Disney. They are headed to a place that they might be able to survive. They've been growing food, in some cases, for generations in their families, and now they are leaving Central America because it's caught in the midst of an epic drought, the likes of which probably has not occurred for at least 1,000 years and led to the collapse of the Mayan civilization. Wow. So, and I lived in Central America, in Belize, for about 2.5 years, and even then, the regional transformation reflecting planetary transformation was well underway. One of the conversations I had probably in July or August of last year, not long before I left in October, was with somebody whose family had been living in that area in the Maya Mountains in western Belize for 25 years. And he said when they moved there, he was 10 years old. 25 years previously, he'd been 10 years old. And he heard from all of the locals that the rainy season lasted 10 months out of the year. The dry season, and that's how in tropical and subtropical areas they define the seasons, not like we do by winter, spring, summer, fall, but instead by the rainy season and the dry season, because the temperature is pretty similar year-round. So when he moved there some 25 years ago, now approaching 26 years ago, the rainy season was always 10 months long. It was very reliably that length of time, and the dry season persisted only for about 2 months. When I moved there in 2016, the rainy season was 6 months long. The rainy season and the dry season pretty much split the country in half, in that area at least. And when we left in October of 2018, the dry season was about 2 months long and had been for that year and the previous year. So that's a very, very rapid transformation from, in a single lifetime, a relatively short lifetime at that, only 25 years, to go from 10 years of rainy season, 10 months of rainy season each year to 10 months of dry season is astonishingly quickly. And we're seeing loss of habitat not just in Central America, but in the Middle East and Northern Africa. I was on tour in Western Europe a little over 4 years ago, and people were pouring into that region from the Middle East and Northern Africa because they were unable to grow food for the first time, sometimes in generations. So they'd been with their families in the Middle East or Northern Africa for literally generations, sometimes dozens of generations. Think about that. And now suddenly they were forced to flee because they could no longer grow food. They were not at all welcome in Western Europe. There's just, we're at the point described by Paul Ehrlich in his book Population Bomb and Garrett Hardin in his many books and writings from the 1960s and 1970s. We have too many people demanding too much stuff, demanding food, for example. How dare us? And everything else that goes along with the modern way of life. And this is the kind of thing we've been warned about since the 1960s. The Population Bomb came out in 1968. Paul Ehrlich and Garrett Hardin have been writing about it, and so is the author of Overshoot in 1980, Bill, I forget his last name, sorry, Calder, no, that's not right, sorry, I forget his name, Catton, there you go, William Catton. So it's not as if we haven't had the warnings.
Right.
For many, many years, we've been warned about too many people on a planet with finite materials, and we just keep charging away. And we've been warned about climate change as well, and also about abrupt climate change. And we've ignored all those warnings so that a few people could put a few bucks in their pockets. That's basically what it boils down to.
Yeah, more.
Yep.
Wet and dry seasons in Central America, but it's interesting that that's just isolated to one. I mean, we can talk for the next hour about all these stories or anecdotal stories about, but in the aggregate, show this global crisis. And so it's as if, I don't know if this is true or not, but that if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump out. But if the frog's in the water and slowly boils, it'll cook. And so that seems to be what's happening is the water's boiling. There's no questions there. All the scientific journals and predominant folks in that world agree that it's boiling. The question becomes it's how long really, or how bad really is it? But we know that it's bad, and we know that at some point in time between now or the most conservative projection, 2050. There's this very short time span where things are going to rapidly fall apart. And as you mentioned, we have migrants, and they're not being welcomed. So because we're not discussing the root cause, so it's all superficial, and we're reacting to situations on the superficial level, and no real thought, meaningful discussions are happening on wide scale. And I don't think that is going to happen before it's way beyond too late.
We have governments of the world that are underlain by ideology, and those ideologies are so dug in, they're so entrenched that I don't see a reasonable, legitimate conversation almost ever coming out of Washington, D.C., or any other government of the world for that matter. So to expect that we would go back to the 1960s, for example, when people on either side of the aisle could have a reasonable conversation, I just don't see that happening. We have, and this is one of the outcomes of virtually every civilization that we have information about through history. They just become increasingly divided. The ideology rises to the fore. The human sacrifices increase in number because of the attempt to appease the gods. So there's a relatively famous cave not far from where I lived in Belize called the Atm Cave, because it was comprised of 3 Mayan words that most people can't remember, much less pronounce. So the Atm Cave, it's not an automatic telling machine. It's not a place to get money. It was a famous death cave. It's one of the more famous death caves in the world because toward the end of the Mayan civilization, there was an increasing number of human sacrifices that transpired in that cave to appease the gods. If we just kill a few more children, not my children, of course, but your children, if we just kill a few more of those children, then that has 2 outcomes: less mouths to feed, and maybe it'll appease the gods and allow it to start raining again.
Wow.
So it's crazy, but you read about these kinds of things on a pretty regular basis as you go back in time. And what we're seeing play out now shouldn't come as a significant surprise for people who studied history, who studied archaeology and anthropology.
Yeah, even like I said last time, I've lived in Cleveland my whole life. And like 5, 6 years ago, I really started to notice the difference in the winters. And this was before I had heard of you, and I was like, wow, something is really wrong. And it doesn't seem like anyone really thinks anything of these such quick changes in the climate. It's kind of funny.
Right. All the proof you need is hiding in plain sight, but it's not even hiding.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And yet there are still people and organizations planting the seeds of doubt. So that delays action until we have absolute consensus, until we have 99.9% of the population of a country absolutely convinced we need to do these three things. And those three things are just not going to happen.
Right.
Well, I think that's one thing I appreciate about you as well is that, clearly spent a long time in academia, accomplished, taught hundreds of students who probably learned a great deal from you, but you're also a common sense engineer from the perspective is you also promote just observing the observable, what's in front of you. You don't need a lot of science to understand that what's happening is going to threaten us, as we can tell with hurricanes that stay in one place and flood cities for a long time. We have late winters, snows in the all over North America. Cyclone bombs that we talked about before. So I appreciate that about you. But to switch gears, why would you go down and sacrifice and risk a quote unquote normal existence in academia and tenure, knowing that you were going to be potentially rejected by your own colleagues, which seems to have happened to some extent? Why would you risk so much for this message?
I always did. We didn't, and when I walked away from my privileged tenured position, I just assumed that because I was in this position of privilege, because I clearly was accomplished in my field, I just assumed that a whole bunch of people would follow. That if I did the right thing, that everybody would look at me and say, hey, look what that guy's doing. I better do that too, because it's clearly the right thing to do, because look, he knows a lot about it. Well, how ridiculous was that? So I thought I would set an example that a lot of people would follow, and I was mistaken about that. It seemed to me that I was taking right action. At the time, we knew that among the many consequences of civilization of industrial civilization, were overheating the planet and driving many species to extinction, and fouling the air and dirtying the water and washing away the soils into the ocean. And the list just goes on. And so it seemed to me that in the face of these horrors that I was teaching about every day in the classroom, that I had to make a choice too. I could either keep talking about it or I could do something about it. And the doing something seemed like it was the reasonable approach. So I walked away from that privilege and tried to point out that there are other ways to live besides on the treadmill that we were all born into. So I tried to live outside the monetary system and do all those things. And then, of course, I found out about the aerosol masking effect, and I was reminded again of the meltdown at the nuclear power facilities when civilization goes away. Suddenly, it didn't seem like such a great idea, but it took a while for that evidence to accumulate. So it was, I started creating the homestead in 2007. I started looking for it in 2004, and I left that homestead in the middle of 2016. And it had become clear to me a couple of years before that it didn't matter anymore. Certainly not what I did as one individual, but because of what's come to be called the McPherson paradox, industrial civilization overheats the planet, and turning off the switch or even reducing industrial activity causes an abrupt rise in global average temperature. So we're in this doomed if you do, doomed if you don't situation. So at that point, I realized that there was no point in me breaking my now badly injured back and at my advancing years to keep digging up soil and planting vegetables and making cheese and all those things, because it had many people followed me and moved off grid and opted out of the monetary system, we wouldn't be having this conversation today.
Right.
Beautiful.
Chalk up one more for the mistakes have been made file.
Well, and maybe you have something? Or
Oh, yeah, I just wanted you to maybe explain the reasoning behind Sam Carana's prediction of the 8-degree rise. Like, is that just on the feedback loops, or what makes him predict that? Or she.
That's a specific feedback loop, 1. So Carana went from plus 10 over the 1750 baseline, and I took issue with that in an essay I wrote 2 weeks after he wrote that essay. So back in 2016, I think I wrote my essay August 1st, and so I think I came up with something like 8.7 or 9 instead of 10, but it doesn't matter, really. We're talking about such an abrupt temperature rise that probably 2 degrees beyond where we're at now is enough to cause the extinction of Homo sapiens. So whether it's really 8.7 or 18 is kind of irrelevant as far as we are concerned. Not as far as the rest of the living planet, obviously. So he added one additional feedback, the loss of clouds. Once it became apparent that at sufficiently high temperatures, sufficiently high levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the clouds would be stripped away, all of them. He added in the HC global average temperature rise associated with the loss of those clouds.
Oh, okay.
So that was just one additional feedback. And, I think he badly underplayed back, I think he wrote his essay approximately July 15th, 2016, and I think he badly underestimated the importance of what he called other feedbacks. And those included, for example, the release of methane and carbon dioxide from terrestrial permafrost. And look around now, you type in terrestrial permafrost or just permafrost into your search engine, and you get all kinds of bad news popping up, indicating that we could experience a very abrupt global average temperature rise from the release of pressurized methane and carbon dioxide from terrestrial permafrost. And so I think he significantly downplayed that. And so this loss of clouds went into the category of other feedbacks. And, going from 0.3 to 8.3 is kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
But that indicates how important these feedbacks are and how underreported they have been in the literature.
So maybe we can talk about that for a moment as well. So I'm not entirely sure, but I think that all the oil trapped underneath the surface of the Earth is from decomposed organic material, largely dinosaurs, right, and other organic material.
Well, plants way more than animals, because plants accounted for way more biomass than animals did.
So it's trapped, over years of tectonic plate movements and erosion. It gets trapped and buried and buried and buried. But is that the same way it works with methane? And if it's currently frozen in terrestrial permafrost, that's why this small, it seems like a very small margin of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius could release all this naturally trapped material that would release huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I mean, is that generally how it works?
Yeah, that's how previous episodes of extreme planetary warming have occurred. It takes a little bit of warming in the beginning. Sometimes that comes from just a wobble in the rotation of the Earth that causes the ice to start melting, so we start coming out of an ice age. And then once we reach these so-called tipping points, or self-reinforcing feedback loops, it gets to a certain minimum temperature that's necessary to melt more ice, cause carbon dioxide to come out of the ocean. And that's what occurs during an El Nino Southern Oscillation. We have heat being released by the ocean, and also carbon dioxide released from the ocean. So we can think of the ocean as a battery that stores a bunch of carbon dioxide and stores a bunch of heat. But once you start heating up the planet, a bunch of that heat comes out of the ocean where it's been stored and spilling out over to the land. And then once that starts happening, we have things like the permafrost that starts melting. We have increased volcanic activity that increases the carbon dioxide and the methane pouring into the atmosphere. We have lava flows, and you can see that happening around the Ring of Fire right now, all the way from the coast of New Zealand, up the eastern coast of Japan, all the way over to the west coast of the United States and Canada. So that's the Ring of Fire, the Pacific Ocean. As those plates are moving, becoming more active, they are causing increased volcanic activity. So all of these things are related. In addition, add to that, like that's not bad enough, the melting of glaciers on land. So I'm not talking about Arctic ice, which is floating. So here I'm thinking about glaciers on land. So water is heavy. If you've ever tried to carry a 5-gallon container of water on your back while fighting fire, for example, you know that water is really heavy. It doesn't take much to really weigh you down. So imagine what happens when those glaciers start melting. They take all that water, that heavy water in ice form that's on, say, the North American plate. It melts off of there. That greatly relieves the mass on the North American plate and causes it to rise. At the same time, it flows onto the Pacific plate and makes it even heavier. So more water now in the Pacific Ocean causes that plate to sink. So that's why we have all this volcanic activity going on, because you got these plates that are shifting and further contributing to carbon dioxide, to heating in the atmosphere, because that's where the volcanoes are, that's where the lava flows are, and what comes out of that? Methane and carbon dioxide, obviously.
Wow. So I know you mentioned the El Nino being a factor in the blue ocean. Can you predict for next year if it will be a El Nino? Is that possible? And do you think it will be bad enough to, cause the blue ocean event?
The latest figures I've seen indicate that there's about a 70% chance that we will enter an El Nino southern oscillation. That was probably a month ago, and I haven't kept up, so it could be that we're either writing off an El Nino happening this year, or it could be that it's very likely to occur. But it's really important. This will be the third El Nino southern oscillation in, I think, 5 years. And they used to occur once every 7 to 10 years. So we're accelerating the rate at which we're seeing El Nino southern oscillations occur. And it could be a really big deal. You look back at the global average temperature associated with previous El Nino events, and there's always a spike. So one of the reasons that the climate deniers say the temperature hasn't warmed in the last 20 years is that they're idiots. And the other reason is that if you go back to the biggest El Nino southern oscillation on record, it was 97, 98. So we see a big spike in temperature because for the most part, that's where we measure temperatures on land. That's where our thermometers are. We don't have a lot of thermometers out in the ocean. So, and that's really unfortunate because roughly 75% of the surface of the planet is ocean. In any event, so we see a tremendous spike in global average temperature in 97, 98 during that El Nino southern oscillation. We see a pretty big one in 15, 16 as well, 2015, 2016. Not quite as big as the one in 97, 98. I suspect if this one, and then what happens is you get this big spike, and then it sort of equilibrates, and the temperature is gradually increasing. They get another big spike, and with the exception of that 97, 98 one, the other El Nino southern oscillations have been near that peak, including 2015, 2016. That was a monster. But in general, the trend is still going up. It's not like this 2016 happened and then all of a sudden everything's all down from there. Not at all. The general trend is still going up. So that was a big burst of heat and a big release of carbon dioxide onto the atmosphere. We're at, 415 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Interestingly, Exxon in 1982 predicted that in 2020 we'd be at 420 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now we're at 415. They nailed it. That was a prediction made a long time ago, and we're very, very close to what they called their high emissions scenario. So really not too bad for big oil. So we certainly could argue that they knew what was coming and have known for a very long time, and proceeded with not only business as usual but the high emission scenarios at every turn. That's where the money is. And of course we had known before then what the impact would be on global average temperature, and James Hansen became famous for talking about it in 1988 on the floor of Congress, obviously 6 years after the ExxonMobil conclusion. But we'd received warnings going back to the 1700s with George Perkins, or the 1800s, mid-1800s, George Perkins Marsh, and in the refereed journal literature was Fente Arrhenius in 1896. So, we've been warned for a really long time, and the conventional approach is there's nothing I can do about it. Nobody's going to do a thing, so I need to make $5 more.
Right. I found it, the exponential function, and I Googled it, and the first thing that popped up was, explanation for regular people, and it said if you take a piece of paper and you folded it over itself, I think 23 times it would reach from the surface of the Earth to the moon. And that just goes to show you something as thin as a piece of paper folded on itself 23 times. So that's the exponential curve, where things are, at 10, you're only in the stratosphere, right? So it starts off pretty slow. But by the time you get to 15, 16, 17 folds, if that were possible, which it isn't, you would be at the moon. And so that, again, just another anecdote to point to where we're at in the story of exponential growth. And that's why, as you're explaining once again, is things are happening more rapidly. We're not seeing the expected results as lower temperatures, right? It's still going up.
Right.
And everything's becoming more condensed. It's happening faster. Things are stronger in the feedback loops, which I always thought it was odd they call it a positive feedback loop, because it's not very positive, but negative wouldn't work either.
Right.
But the positive feedback, it keeps building upon itself over and over and over, and that's why you can go from 2019 today until 2026 with no humans, the Earth not inhabitable for human beings, not
right.
suitable for life.
In fact, not suitable for mammalian life. That's the direction we're headed, is no wildlife by 2026. So you think we'll be fine with no other animals, with no other vertebrates or mammals on the planet? Come on. Human hubris much?
Right. And as you've said, who would want to live in that world?
Right.
That Mad Max scenario of chaos and anarchy.
Well, it's not just the human behavior, it's the absence of life. I just have no interest whatsoever in living on a dead planet. If it's just me and Bermuda grass, no thanks.
Right. And again, you don't miss it until it's gone. And it's, again, interesting that, hubris, as you mentioned, that, Homo sapien, the trade war, economies, GDP, nominal GDP, PPP, growth, even economists, even in a low growth area, they call it an area of not positive growth. It's everything has to be presented in a wave of expansion, which is great. The humans have expanded, but just like anything, and I think you've mentioned this, even as a professor, you were teaching your students that there's always a price to be paid. You can't have exponential expansion and growth and more without having something that balancing that in the background.
Right. This is why I've taken to calling it not the exponential function, but the excremental function, because it's really a shitty deal, and it just keeps piling up. In my recent presentations, I think one of which is getting edited right now and will be loaded and put on my blog tomorrow morning. I think we will include this one. If not, you have to just look back over the previous few presentations, and there's there's a clip illustrating the exponential function. There's a guy, he looks like an engineer. Sorry for any, I didn't mean to insult anybody with that.
That's typically a good thing.
And he puts up 7 blocks, and he indicates that a domino is capable of knocking over a domino 1.5 times the size of the previous domino. So he starts with something that I think is 7 millimeters tall or 5 millimeters tall, tiny, tiny. And then 7 blocks out, he's got something that's about 1 meter tall and weighs 100 pounds. There's just 7 blocks from something that he has to take a tweezers to put down on the floor and then so carefully touch it. His breath would have blown it over and started the thing. You know, it would have been off the topic. And he points out that that's, I think it's, I said 7, but I think it's 13. So that's 13 dominoes. It goes up to 1 meter in size. Okay, no big deal. It goes from this big to 1 meter and 100 pounds. But then he points out that if he had taken 29 instead of 13, 13 is all he can really manage. 13 is all one guy can lift up and put up into place before he runs the tape, right? If he'd done 29, that last one would have been the size of the Empire State Building. That's astonishing to go from this, and you just increase it by 1.5 times each time. So it's not even a doubling, it's not a quadrupling. It's just increasing by 1.5 times. 29 times you go from this, you got the Empire State Building.
Right.
And he would have had a real hard time lifting that up and putting it back in place.
Right, I guess we can move on, but that also reminds me, I think all of us, if you had a public school education, we all learned about the dysfunction with the rice and the chess game, and the story is there's a lord and a peasant, and but so on. I'll give you 1 piece of rice for each of the squares on the chess, you know, and by the end of the squares you have, you know, trillions of pieces of rice. But it's important, this topic, because we're living in this. Every human being on the planet is living in it right now. Some are aware to it, most are not, but we're in it. And things are going to change very rapidly and very quickly. And unless there's some sort of I tend to, maybe it is too late. That's not relevant to me. But even in the face of a certain death or extinction, if you will, I would still like to see our species rise to the occasion. To have, even in North America, a national public school initiative for kids to present ideas, much like a science fair.
Sure.
To come, and at least we would go down fighting, if you will, to have that one last moment in our time to say, what, we're going to be accountable. Yes, we are limited through our evolution of our own species. We realized it, too late, but we realized it now, and let's see what we can do and see if we can't make an impact.
That would be awesome. Right. If we can, because we could display so many things. You could talk about history. You could take a classroom full of 20 students at any age with a decent teacher and have them get involved with a discussion about abrupt climate change. What are the impacts on societies, on individuals, on communities? What are the impacts on non-human life? What is the interplay between non-human and human life? What are the interactions between plants and animals? What does it mean to experience abrupt change? How does that play out relative to our existence on the planet? Have we experienced exponential changes before? And if so, what do they look like? There's a million different topics there that a good teacher could just take on and have students run after. That would be just fascinating.
And what a way to ignite the youth of feeling like they're contributing to our society, and they would be so motivated, excited. And so again, I suppose that's wishful thinking. I think a lot of us, and maybe everybody's experienced that, even though your ideas are altruistic and nice and needed, they often don't happen. So I'm under no illusion that we're going to see that sort of event, because it would all be extremely positive and I think helpful. And psychologically, I think there's a lot of human beings who just feel sad or blue.
Right.
And they don't know why. And we have lots of antidepressants, but I think everybody secretly knows, even if it's very suppressed, that life is going faster than it should.
Yeah.
That words are
Lightning bugs, which I don't see anymore,
Yeah.
honeybees, all kind, and I think that, but if we were working on this more overtly, then maybe people would even start to feel even better.
Right. How could you not? I mean, people are not going to try to conserve or protect anything if they don't have some knowledge of that thing. And probably they need to have some love of that thing or that process or whatever. So until you can get somebody interested in the topic instead of ignoring it, what are you going to accomplish? Nothing. And then if you can go a step further, when students become captivated by a topic, either because it's just within their genetic material that they find this topic interesting, or because it's presented to them in a way that it seems like it's important, that's where real change happens at the individual level, at the level of the learner, at the level of communities, at the level of society. Is with that love for studying a particular topic and then rabidly chasing after it. That's how students get graduate degrees. That's how they go on to become professors and become renowned in their field, is because of that innate curiosity and the underlying drive to understand more and more.
I think your teaching would dramatically impact people's lives. There are a lot of people out there who are suicidal, sad, or just plain unhappy, in their job. And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. Like, even myself, when I heard about your teaching, I quit my job, and now I'm a part-time dog walker, and I love it. I'm outside all day, and I'm realizing I'm at the end of my life, so that I don't have to save up for retirement, stuff like that. So I really want to spread this, because this teaching, it's literally like kind of Buddhism in a way. It's like you're just faced with impermanence.
Right.
And you everyday life, and I look at my cat, I look at my fiance, and I'm like, wow, these are not going to be here that much longer. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and your fiance goes, what do you mean I'm not going to be here much longer? And
yeah.
your fiance never turns his back on you again. Well, yeah, I am not a Buddhist, but I have been influenced by the philosophy of Buddhism, not the religion of Buddhism,
Right.
not the reincarnation stuff, but
Yeah.
by the philosophy, and you pointed out one of the important points, that of impermanence. All is impermanent. And another one is not being attached to the outcome, taking right action and not being attached to the outcome. So there are various principles underlying the philosophy of Buddhism that have been very influential for me, and that I tried to adhere to in my teaching and in my life. So as one example, I was on Instagram this morning. I know, mistakes have been made.
Oh, I'm guilty. I follow you.
And I saw one of my former students on there. And this is a student who I thought just got it, the whole thing. She's bright. She grew up in Puerto Rico. She knows about poverty. She knows that, her family was greatly affected by the hurricane that destroyed the infrastructure there. She knows, right? She knows. And she was showing the picture of her with her third child, who's just like this big now. Like, oh, really? And so that's a case where it's important that I not be attached to the outcome. Because every course I ever taught, I pointed out that no good will come at the level of society or of our species if we continue to grow the human population. This is an idea that had been around for 50 years when I started, at least 50 years. And Paul Ehrlich and Garrett Hardin and William Catton and a dozen other people made their careers studying human population overshoot in the 60s and 1970s. And so I was just continuing this long established trend of pointing out the hazards that will result from increased human population growth on a finite planet. And the response, essentially all of my students went out and made little copies of themselves. And if I were attached to the outcome, that would have driven me crazy.
Right.
You know, and I was in the classroom for 21 years. And I saw it, obviously, over the course of that time. By the time I was done, I was old enough to have students who were the children of my students.
Yeah.
You know, think about that. 21 years in the classroom is old enough, is long enough that I got a 22-year-old in my classroom, and 21 years later, I could have a 21-year-old in my classroom who would be the student of that 22-year-old. So, you know, you can let this stuff drive you crazy or not.
Yeah.
And at some point, we have to let go of the strong emotions we feel that drive us to taking so many of these things seriously. Right? So, of course, greenhouse gases are a big deal. Of course, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, we need to do that at the same time we're doing something with the aerosols, to keep them in the air, or to mitigate for the reduced aerosol masking effect if we reduce our own carbon footprints. Of course, we want to adjust every aspect of our lives so that it provides potential for future generations to have the same kinds of experiences we had. But we don't have any control over that. You and I, as individuals, we're one of 7.7 billion people, so we can't get attached to the outcome of me and you and 17 other people taking responsibility for themselves when we got 7.7 billion people who couldn't give a shit.
Right.
And at some level, that's even understandable, because that's the evolutionary drive. That's what natural selection screams at us to do. Flight or fight. So initially, it's all about survival. And now, of course, within this set of living arrangements, we're pretty comfortable. On a daily basis in the United States, we don't have to worry about walking down the street. We don't need to carry a machete just to get from here to the grocery store.
Yeah, and we have a grocery store full of anything that we could possibly want.
Exactly. And then next step is procreate. If you survive to be old enough that you can start having babies, the evolutionary drive is to push you in that direction. And so how can we criticize people for pursuing their evolutionary instincts? You can't. That's the reason we are here. That's the reason the three of us are having this conversation, is because our parents had that genetic inclination to breed. Of course they did. That's what allows every single species to survive. It's also a primary contributor to the demise of every single species. So it's really a catch-22 all by itself. And then the third big thing that evolution by natural selection drives us to do is accumulate material possessions. It's an indication of signaling. It means that I'm important enough that you should have sex with me because, look, I got this great shirt, or I got this great car, or I got this great house, right? So there's that genetic signaling that goes on. And in addition, it tends to make you more safe. So at some point, somebody walked out of the cave with a rock, sort of inadvertently maybe, and then comes across a saber-toothed tiger and says, rock, meet tiger, and survived because of the rock. And so then he goes back to the cave and he says, Grog needs more rocks.
And that's who we are.
And that's why we're all living in 2,500 square foot houses with electricity and running water.
Right.
Yeah, and it really seems like we're kind of, like we talked about last time, how even the school systems, they paint, you said they paint the walls a certain color to like dumb us down and numb us.
Oh.
And it just seems like we are a society of completely numb. Like no one has any idea this is even going on. It's all about the 9 to 5 and there's no thought of anything different. It just seems like this is inevitable, you know.
I would add to that though, and say I think that, you know, Guy, you hit it right on the head earlier in that therein lies the problem statement, if you will, in which you can't villainize a species for doing what it was bred to do, and you're not, and nobody is. It's happening. There's an unawareness, as Kat is saying, and it's for us that are aware, and I'm not saying that I'm able to transcend myself, but I would like to take that journey with everybody else and see if we could give it a shot so that we could live completely differently than how, the lion will lay with the lamb one day. It's time that we start laying with the lamb and start being different than what we are, because it's leading to our own demise.
Yeah.
And as a thinking, conscious, the first thinking conscious species in the history of this planet, I thought when I was younger that we would be able to do what it was necessary to jump out of the boiling water, but
Of course.
there's no indication that that's going to occur.
Yeah, I don't
Of course.
have-
We all think that. Everybody has thought that. I suspect there are a significant number of people in every generation who think that this is the generation, I'm going to be part of this massive transition that's going to turn this thing around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody wants to save the world.
Right.
And instead, as Pink Floyd pointed out in the 1970s, we are comfortably numb.
Right.
Right.
Another brick in the wall.
I sometimes feel like I'm living in the Truman Show, that Jim Carrey movie.
Right,
And
right.
It really feels like that. It's kind of surreal sometimes. I just start laughing like, wow.
Well, it really does feel like something that somebody made up. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
you walk down the street to the grocery store, you aren't under any sort of threat. There's no saber-toothed cats between here and the grocery store.
Mhm.
And you go in and you use these little made-up pieces of paper, of all things. Or better yet, you have this piece of plastic that you flash at somebody. And next thing you know, you're walking out of there with food.
Yeah.
What? You could describe this to somebody 200 years ago, they wouldn't believe a word of it.
Right.
And in that, there's a lot of things to be impressed by. But also in that is the paradox in that it's also the thing that's threatening us.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. It's our desire for comfort. It's our pursuit of comfort that has driven this set of living arrangements and is, at least in part, responsible for our demise.
Right.
Of course
But
it is.
Even my grandparents were comfortable in the 1930s, 1940s, but it's almost like we completely lost balance. Like I talked about the 5G thing coming. I mean, everyone's like this on their cell phone, me included. And it's just like, it's far gone. I don't know.
Yeah. Yes, it's far gone. It's way far gone. And that applies to almost everything. People tell me all the time, if we just do these 375 things, if we would do the 100 things from the book Drawdown, but we aren't going to do those things. And it's too late for doing those things anyway. At the rate from 2-3 years ago, at the rate we were consuming materials, what we call resources, don't even get me started.
Mhm.
At the rate we were consuming materials a few years ago, we're going to run out of everything by 2030. Then what? Rare earths are called rare for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
You think the solar panel fairy shows up and just drops those things down on us?
Mhm.
You don't get wind turbines by putting a quarter under your pillow at night. So this stuff is not magic. We know how these things work, and we know that we're literally consuming the planet. And we know where that goes. You can't pursue a scorched earth policy for generations and be surprised when you have a scorched earth.
Right, and I just see most people, even people who are pretty wealthy, even if they constantly go to these activities and get these things, it just doesn't seem like they're actually happy. It's just on to the next thing, so there's also that piece.
Well, yeah, the United States has one of the lowest, I don't remember the name of that index, the happiness index,
Mhm.
Yeah.
of any of the industrialized countries. And gee, what a surprise. It's because that's not what we do in this country. In this country, we jump on the damn treadmill. We're beat up by the constant messaging that he who dies with the most toys wins, instead of he who dies with the most toys dies. Right?
Right.
Even if you have the most toys, you still die. And so maybe we should be focusing on experiences instead of acquisitions. Maybe we should be focusing on relationships instead of accomplishments. But those are hard things to drive home to people when all they've ever heard, and sometimes, almost all the time, in fact, it's unsaid, it's just assumed. We just assume that paradise is the next big raise away, that paradise is just one promotion away. And we've become a culture so driven by material possessions that I don't see a way out. I can't imagine there would be this massive rise in consciousness that would allow us suddenly, inexplicably, to overcome ourselves.
Right. Yeah, that would be highly improbable, I would speculate.
Yeah, and I'd be a huge fan, don't get me wrong.
I'd be dancing naked in the street with you, but it's just, I don't think that's a joy.
Just to be clear, I didn't sign on for that.
Oh,
Yeah, me either. I'll not be there.
Well, I do think that, again, we have, I actually I've been watching this come from afar, since I was born, really. And I was watching since 2012, Larsen C in the Antarctic. It was breaking. Eventually, a portion of it broke away, and I remember watching. It finally broke away in like 2015. Every year, I would check the news cycles, and finally, it went away. And I was looking, and I stumbled across the work that you were doing, and I contacted Kat, and I said, you've got to hear this, and from a science perspective as well, but there is also just a sense of relief that I'm not crazy. Look, somebody respectable is making the same statements with scientific evidence and a legitimate background, things that I was just thinking about. Wow, this made me feel a lot better. And I feel like, and same with Kat.
I was so relieved.
Yeah, I mean, so relieved. It became almost a part, something that was cathartic. To having a really bad day. Seriously, if I'm having a really bad day, I'll find myself 15 minutes and listen to you.
Yeah, I think that's important to bring up, because same with me. It's like there's a way out of what you're going through.
So you're saying misery loves company, and that's why you listen to me?
No.
No, not at all. But authenticity. Now,
sometimes.
And I know you would agree, the subject matter sucks. I wish this wasn't the authentic information or discussion that I was having, but regardless of the content, it's real, and it's not exactly pleasant, which makes it something that's a harder reality, but usually the harder things are the most rewarding things as well. So, but for the community though too, I feel like there's, and you mentioned it, and I think we all did, but that is, I think, the most difficult part of this experience. It is very difficult to watch animals full of plastic and human waste and the insanity and all the just foul way that we treat ourselves and Mother Earth. That's tough itself, but it's also tough in a small community too, that we're all in that we see it happening. We would be happy to participate in things to make it different, but there is no outlet, there is no channel, because apparently the species wants to self-sabotage, and that's what they're dead set on doing, and that's what's happening, and it's very difficult to come to grips with that.
It's not just that. It's anybody who tries to step in and point out where we're headed and what might be done about it becomes the bad person. The gaslight.
Punish the messenger, imprison the whistleblower, destroy the truth and delegitimize the person speaking the truth, which has been going on for eons. And every time that's happened in the history of this species, it's always been proven sooner or later, usually later, how valuable that information is.
Sorry, we are.
What we did to those people.
Right. And so it's the same thing. It's the same thing we've been seeing for generations. We shouldn't be particularly surprised. I just wish it was happening to somebody else.
No.
That's also the human response, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Well, we're coming upon an hour, but I just wanted to sort of close with, if you were teaching your students right now and knowing what you're knowing, what would be like your main message to them outside of academics, like how to live?
The same as my message has been for a long time, that I talk about all the time on my YouTube channel and at Nature Bats Last, that no matter how long we have, even if I'm wrong about everything, your life is still short. Even if you live to be 100, and you won't, if you're a student of mine, unless you come into the classroom and you're 99 and a half. But I don't get very many of those students. Even if you're quite old and you live to be an old, I sometimes present this anecdote. In March of 2015, the world's oldest human being at the time turned 117 years old. And at her 117th birthday party, she was asked to ponder what that was like. And she said, it seemed rather short. She was 117 years old. It seemed rather short. And then she died a few weeks later, just to put a punctuation mark on her message, that it seemed rather short. And we don't have long. So that's my point is, given that we don't have long, given that we've mostly spent our entire lives adhering to the expectations of others, maybe put those two together. Maybe acknowledge that your life is not going to last very long. And instead of adhering to the expectations of others, you might, as a consequence, live differently. You might be more bold. You might try to live outside of societal expectations for a minute or an hour or a day or a week or a lifetime, and not be influenced by people who think you're weird just because you walk differently, because you sing differently, because you do things differently than seemingly everybody else does. You're you. Nobody else gets to be that. Nobody else gets to be you. You're stuck with it. And all the other jobs are taken. You might as well do it to the best of your ability. So live large. We don't have long. I'm not saying that you should live large at the expense of other people. In fact, my greatest joy comes when I help other people. And so there's something we learn from that as well. Like I say every now and then, passionately pursue a life of excellence. Your life is short. Pursue love. Pursue excellence. Do what you love. Do it well. At the edge of extinction, only love remains.
Well, thank you, Guy. It was a pleasure speaking with you and an honor.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care, Guy.
Thanks.